Kieran, we are back for another episode. How are you doing?
Good, bro. Good to be back. Struggling through the heat, but happy to have a chat.
Are you melting in your chair right now?
I have been melting, yeah. I'm a sweaty boy at the moment. Not too comfortable, but still happy to have a chat.
It's been sweltering hot in Melbourne for like the last 3 or 4 days. It kicked off with a banger 44-degree day, and it's been hot ever since. So all I've done for about 3 days is just sweat at work. So I'm hydrating again. All the electrolytes are going in, and the best sustenance is heresy. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today. So to cut the formalities short, we're going to introduce a very special guest to have a chat to today. Let me just find the drum roll sound here. Oh, it's Pongo drums. Welcome the debut showing, Wilph at Diverging Realms.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm very well, thank you. It's nice, and I think it's 6 degrees here in the UK. Sunny, crisp,
lovely,
beautiful winter day.
Sounds
Perfect
magical.
For a pub walk, you know. So,
thanks for coming on the show today, Wilph. Now, for anyone who doesn't know who Wilph is, and you love your heresy, have you been hiding under a rock?
I've been buried under a rock by some other names. One might describe it as a tombstone.
Hey, you can't talk about friends like that. Wilph, everybody, is the sculpting extraordinaire, and I'm sure you've either seen his models online somewhere or at an event. It's safe to say that, Wilph, you're probably one of the longest running and influential sculptors out there these days, especially in the heresy community. But now you're starting to sort of branch out to other IPs and systems like that. So that's something I want to have a chat to you about as well. But do you maybe want to just touch on the start of your sculpting journey and what maybe triggered that for you, and then maybe like your little sculpting journey up to today?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something quite wonderful about sculpting for the hobby, and that's that 3D printers are relatively cheap, sort of in comparison to like what we do. So a lot of us like own them. So I bought my first resin 3D printer, and often we buy them because we want to print an army. It's not we want to sculpt them ourselves. So I bought my first Elegoo Mars, I think, because I really wanted to do some allied militia for my Blood Angels. This is back 2018. Maybe 2019. And I really wanted to use the Feudal Guard range from one of the OG 3D modelers, which is the Maker's Cult. So you sort of end up with like the tools to do 3D sculpting from the get-go. Everybody has a computer, you have a 3D printer. And as soon as you have a 3D printer and you are using somebody else's files, it's very easy to start kit bashing, I guess, is probably the way that most people talk about it. Digi bashing is something other people say as well. So you sort of start off, I had these Maker's Cult Feudal Guard files, and I just wanted to change a few things. So you download one of the many sort of free programs. I used Mesh Mixer at the time. And that's just a case of you sort of, smushing together files to sort of give, maybe it's put a little iconography on, or just, I think I did a couple of different helmets because I wanted some like lion helmet designs they didn't do. And it's like such a low bar for entry, and one thing sort of snowballs into the other. You know, you start off by 3D printing somebody else's files, then you start off by modifying somebody else's files with other people's files, and then you're like doing your own modifications. And then I discovered a free software that lots of people probably know called Blender. So Blender is sort of an open, free, all-in-one package, really. You know, you can do what's called hard surface modeling, or you can do sculpting, and you can do a whole load of other things. But in terms of 3D printing, what we do, that's kind of Blender can do basically everything that you'd want it to do, and obviously it's free. And because it's free, there's quite a good online community in terms of tutorials. So I started using Blender to modify these files, and then you just start getting a little bit of you know, people start to know you in the community. I remember getting a commission, and you sort of look back on those early commissions with not shame, but a certain amount of regret, because you're like, you know, what I did maybe wasn't the best. But I think there's a certainly for, you know, just to sort of tangent ever so slightly, there's a certain benefit that I don't think exists anymore for new sculptors getting into the space, which is back when we started, which was sort of COVID. The sort of heyday of like new 3D printers coming out constantly. I mean, you guys probably remember that there was a skepticism in the community about whether 3D printing could have been like good enough for Heresy.
Yeah. The fidelity of the pieces that you were printing, they were questionable at the time.
Yeah, exactly. So there's all this sort of uncertainty, but as part of this uncertainty comes a great amount of flexibility and acceptance. So a lot of the files out there at the time were kind of a bit rubbish.
Yes.
You know, the prints weren't great, the files weren't great, but it meant that as like a amateur getting started, you could kind of make, you know, to be honest, quite terrible stuff, but still find the community, because everybody's stuff was terrible, and people were very used to like downloading a file and being like bloody hell, I'm gonna have to fix this, fix that, you know, print it out, like cut it up, green stuff it. And obviously that doesn't exist nowadays, which is good, but you know, but at the time it meant it was a bit of the Wild West, and sort of getting into it and sort of having a bit of spunk and sort of trying stuff out, you could get away with a lot of stuff. And obviously we're middle of COVID. I was doing a lot of what's called alt heresy at the time, which is still probably like I would describe like the nerdiest part of heresy, which is going off and doing a lot of like what if scenarios. You know, what if we, you know, swapped all the Primarchs around, or what if like the loyalists were traitors and the traitors were loyalists, that kind of thing. But what that does is it makes you think about heresy designs and legion designs and armor designs and world designs constantly. So that all sort of came to a head, and I moved to France to live above my father's microbrewery. You know, I'd come out of university, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, and I was in France. I didn't have a job, but I'd sort of got good with this Blender thing, or what I thought was good at the time. I had like a ton of ideas, and so I thought, why not give it a go? So I started my Patreon, and I mean, it's in some ways it's kind of like a wonderful, you know, talked about it's like low bar of entry, but you don't, because you're just making files on your computer. You're not trying to buy an expensive machinery. You're not trying to employ a bunch of people. You're not shipping product across the world. You know, you're putting 3D files up on the internet, 10 people could download them, or 100 people could download them, or 1,000 people could download them. The amount of work you've put in is basically the same. So the barrier for entry is so low, and you don't need much startup capital. And so that's kind of how I got my start. And I mean, I was in France for 4 years. I've just come back to England, and I'm very lucky that whatever I'm taking out of my brain and putting on the computer, and then people are able to print off, has been successful enough that it's kind of my job now. It doesn't really feel like a job. Still don't quite fully believe it. But yeah, this is where I am right now, and we'll see how long it goes.
So you did touch on the sculpting programs, which is something that I originally wanted to ask you about. So Blender being free and to a degree, I don't know, would you call that like open source at all?
Yeah. So you do
to a point.
Yes, I mean, one of the big strengths of Blender is that you can get what's called add-ons, which are basically, they're modifications to the software that people can just go away and make. Some of them are distributed for free. Some of them come packaged with Blender when you download it.
Similar to like a plugin for another piece of software.
Yeah, exactly. And they're very powerful. Like, probably if I was like advising people on what to do, I wouldn't, I would say don't go crazy with the add-ons, because I think sometimes people sort of download the initial software and they sort of chuck all these add-ons in, and you're sort of adding complexity to an already complex program. But some of them are so powerful that you kind of almost need to learn Blender with them there already, because it's like just changes the workflow completely. But yeah, so I guess in that sense it'd be open source.
Is it a steep learning curve to jump into that 3D sculpting world? And do you have any like fine art fundamentals that you sort of base your skill set on that's helped you in this sculpting journey?
So I always liked art when I was at secondary school, and I studied architecture at university. So I've always had sort of like a somewhat of a grounding in, I've done life drawing, and I've always been like a sketcher and a doodler, and I sort of draw constantly. Not necessarily very well, but it's about the thinking. I think for a lot of it, it's not about actually producing anything good. It's about going on that creative journey. Obviously, architecture, you are introduced to more like CAD based programs, not like sculpting programs, but stuff like SketchUp or Autodesk, and those do give you like a certain amount of a sort of certain amount of understanding, at least. I think in terms of, is it hard to get into, it's kind of like a yes and a no answer, really. I think I would say Blender for me isn't hard to learn, but it's hard to learn what you need to learn, if that makes sense. So Blender is a program where you can do 2D Ghibli style animations, or you can do mocap, or you can do 3D modeling, or you can do hyper realistic, AAA video game grade level.
It's super powerful.
Yeah, it's such a jack of all trades that I think sometimes people log in and they're just like, and especially when you look for tutorials, you're sort of going through tutorials and then you're like, is this actually helping me design a sculpt for 3D printing? Probably not, and then somebody starts talking about how you can do sort of realistic shader designs, and you're like, I don't need to know any of that, except if I want to do like a nice render for my Instagram. A perfect example is, a challenge I'm facing at the moment is, how do you do like Unreal Wargaming bases are obviously the sort of gold standard, everybody uses them. I'd love to be able to do that kind of thing as like a 3D printable file. It's very hard to get that level of detail, like sort of in Blender. because when you search for it, a lot of what will come up will be stuff about how to do it for game assets or for rendering assets, and that's just like a completely different workflow to what we want. And so I think sometimes people get in there, and I often say to people when I've taught how to use Blender in the past, you only need like 10 tools maybe, and those 10 tools are pretty simple, and really the most important thing is like your thought process when it comes to sculpting, and that's kind of like not a Blender specific thing. That's just kind of like a process thing. It could be, you know, you could be using ZBrush or 3ds Max or anything like that. It's just, you know, so the actual learning actually how to use the tools is pretty simple, but you kind of need somebody to sit you down and be like, these are the 10 tools you want to use, don't touch anything else. And that's kind of why I say to people, you know, don't necessarily go for the add-ons. You know, I think probably if I was to make an analogy to painting, you know, it's a bit like if somebody you hadn't painted before and just immediately wanted to jump straight into doing, you know, and somebody immediately wanted to jump into, I don't know, like learning how to do NMM, or immediately wanted to jump into like using a 600-pound airbrush or something like that, you'd be like, whoa, let's slow down. Let's learn how to, like, you know, use a paintbrush first and do some basic
fundamentals.
Yeah, exactly.
You know what's really hard to teach is how to maybe critique your own work and to have a good eye for things. And I think, like, maybe touching on what you said earlier about the early days of the 3D sculpting sort of scene within the hobby, how things were kind of a little bit maybe grossly misproportioned, or maybe they haven't got particular details right. How hard is it to learn how to sculpt with good taste, or maybe like be critical of or analytical of the sculpting job that you've done and make corrections to things like proportions or finer detailing sort of things? Because I find, like, even when people approach me with painting questions, especially around composition of models, like to give them an eclectic answer is not only hard to describe, but hard for another person to think similarly. Am I making sense in my question?
Yeah, because I think what you're kind of describing is that sort of intangible, like, vibe that
call it a vibe, yeah.
And I think as well with what we do, I think it's very easy if you were doing like fine art, you know, to be like, look, you know, what you're trying to get is good anatomy, or what you're trying to get is to like render what you can see in front of you in a realistic manner. But we're trying to take fur, for example. So fur on a model is not realistic. You want a little bit of realism in there because you want it, you know, you want it to feel like fur. But what you want it to be is you want it to represent a sort of removed, like idealized, like vibe of fur. You want people to look at that and go like, that feels like fur to me. And like, as part of that, there's so many questions, you know, like what kind of fur, like what's the atmosphere of the fur? You know, you can't start asking all these questions that actually on the surface sound quite silly, but actually really important, because you know, the kind of fur you would do for like a chaos warrior, for example, that sort of like big, you know, sort of big strands looking quite menacing, is very different to how you do the fur for, you know, somebody with like a little like panther fur cloak or something like that. And maybe the difference,
a different creature.
Yeah. And part of the difference is informed by like the realism, which is, oh, on one guy the fur is from a bear, and on the other guy the fur is from a panther. but the difference is also informed by like the vibe you want the model to have. And so you're trying to sort of triangulate the perfect position, and that's kind of very subjective in a lot of ways. You know, there's some objective things to it, which is, you know, is it fun to paint? Which is obviously at the end of the day what we're sculpting for. You know, is it fun to paint? Is it okay to print?
Yes.
But
and
so
these are all sorry, but these are all deep considerations when you're actually working on a model, right? Does that fur read like fur? Does it capture the vibe that I want it to? Is the paintability of it going to benefit the painter?
Yeah.
And are these things going to be printable in fidelity that's going to benefit all three factors?
Yeah. And I think, you know, and there's a, you know, and there's a certain, I guess, like where the artistic nature of the whole thing comes in, is that you as like the sculptor have to decide. So I like my human beings small, and I like my proportions like less heroic, but than a lot of people. And, you know, I think probably people wouldn't have, you know, if I made my standard human beings, you know, my standard human beings like 30 mil to the eye usually, and if I made them 34 mil to the eye, they'd be more fun to paint. But you know, there's a certain point which, you know, at risk of being slightly crass, like you kind of as a sculptor have to say fuck you to the painters. I think a lot of the time, like there's a lot of painters who are like, no, I want, you know, I want perfectly smooth surfaces because I'm going to do all my fancy like blends and highlights and freehand and all that kind of stuff. You know, I want you to create a canvas for me. And I think part of the joy of like the original Forge World models, you know, if you take the original Ed ScoMo Solar Auxilia, you know, if you're talking to painters in the past, like they think they're a nightmare. Like just they're not fun to paint really. But and the new ones I think are more fun to paint. They just have less like greebles and like tiny little details you have to highlight and all that kind of stuff. But yes, I prefer the old ones because there's a certain amount of like, fuck you, this is the vision I have. Like, you know, the old Palatine blades, I think, is another example. Whereas if I think the Palatine blades nowadays were made, all of that trim would be much thicker because it makes the model more accessible, more fun to paint, like less of a complete chore. But there's something magical about like the fuck you energy of like the original Palatine blades, where they're like, no, actually, if you want to paint these models, you just got to get good.
And I think what's important to mention about those two examples is that they've stood the test of time as well. Like they still look great today. Whereas something that may have been sculpted in maybe the sculptor's been a little bit more lenient or considerate of other factors.
Yeah.
And that means that the model's kind of set in that time period, or now it kind of looks a little bit dated.
Yeah.
I think, it's funny you mentioned those two examples because I think those two examples still look amazing today as models. I mean, they might be a little bit pokey and a little bit maybe small when you compare them to today's newer models and proportions and plastics. However, the vibe that they capture, the detail, and the artistic expression that the sculptors have used on them too still stands the test of time.
Yeah, no, exactly. So, I mean, to answer your original question, can it be taught? I think it's hard because there's a sliding scale. You know, what do we do? On one end, we are like modelers. You know, we're engineers. You know, we take a design from an artist and we turn it into like a 3D STL format for you to print. And there's like a lot of, you know, there's creativity involved in that, but it is just a sort of process orientated I've just got to make something that like ticks all these boxes. And that's what a lot of I think that's what a lot of like the really good GW sculpts like nowadays, like the Cadian range or the new Sisters of Battle range, or even some of like the new like Heresy, like Mark 6 tactical marines. Like, I'm not a huge fan of Mark 6, my least favorite armor mark. But I think like as a piece of design, like the Mark 6 tacticals are absolutely fabulous. So that's like one end of the scale. And then on the other end of the scale is like, just to be an artiste, like, here's my vision. And all of us sort of place ourselves somewhere on that scale. Like, are you just sort of mechanically making like models for people to paint and play with? All of us are to a certain extent. Or are you making like a vision, like a creative vision of what you can see out there in the world, and your interpretation of heresy or your interpretation of fantasy or whatever it might be? And all of us are doing that to a certain point. And so you just kind of got to decide where on that you fall. And so I think what that makes it is tricky, because there's a benefit to making models that are like, to taking a GW sculpt and like really studying it and copying it in the same way that like there might be a benefit to trying to do like an heavy metal paint style. Like there's a benefit to that, because you learn, GW we all give them stick, but they're very, very good at what they do. And there's a lot of reasons, they're not idiots. So, there's a benefit to doing that. But, I've always been relatively outspoken in that I think it's really, really boring. I think it's, not only is it boring, but it's also just, almost like a criminal waste of like potential to see all these like amazing sculptors who just do like GW clones that are almost indistinguishable. All of us, have trod the line too close probably. But if you're going to do that, then for me at least, like put your own spin on it. And so good taste, I would say, comes from, a combination of being able to replicate what's already there. You've got to understand the volumes, you've got to understand what a marine is. It comes from having a personal idea of what a marine might be. So a good example, do you know an artist called Sedival? You probably would have seen his big
Saturnine.
Yeah. I don't agree with his interpretation of Marines, but that's fine. Like you look at his stuff, and it's like such a strong vision of what like a Marine should be. I'm not a Lunax massive Marine kind of guy, but like it's cool to have a vision. And I think it's cool to have, so he understands what he thinks a Marine is. And then so you sort of take that, I understand how to make it work, like sort of in a mechanical sense. You've got your sense of like what you think it should be, sort of atmospherically and vibes based. And then it's just trying to combine those things together, obviously then with the understanding of how to use the programs.
That segues perfectly into the next question I wanted to ask you. And that was about developing your own style. Because I think we can, like nearly everyone that knows your work can pick your work out of a lineup. It's like, hey, if I'm gonna put Rage Against the Machine on the stereo, people who walk past are gonna be like, that's Rage Against the Machine, right? I'm gonna pop up like a couple of photos here, just so we can sort of maybe touch on these and discuss them. But I mean, you were one of the first sculptors that really brought Saturnine vision to life, I would say, in the early days. And I want to say this was like COVID era, right?
Yeah. So I mean, I've done. This kind of goes back to the Alt Heresy, because for us in Alt Heresy, like you're always looking for these little nuggets of unexplored, I suppose, lore. And for all the nerds of the internet, like what is Saturnine? It's kind of been a buzz, a hot topic forever. So I think I've done One, two. I think I've done 4 or 5 renditions of Saturnine over my time. This one on the screen is the latest version. But I think, it kind of, for me at least, it plays into a wider, interesting topic, which I wish, so take Mark III, for example. Before we knew what the new Mark III was going to be like, there was an interesting conversation. Like, we'd seen the Mark VI. What's the Mark III going to be like? And I think most sculptors would look at the, and probably Samit will want to hunt me down and take my head for this, but I think you look at the original Mark III and say, it's kind of a goofy design. It works at the scale that it works at, but just like making it bigger, like, isn't going to cut it in the new style of Heresy. Okay. But the concept of Mark III is relatively simple. You take Mark II, whatever you've made that be, and you've added armor plates to it. And in that is like a whole range of like possibilities. So like what Mark III could be like a whole different things. And obviously we've ended up with what we've ended up with. But I think there's a lot of units out there where it's like, there's quite an interesting sort of question that you can ask yourself as like a creator. And you could probably do this with painting and, how would I represent like X chapter or X? But for sculpting, it's quite interesting to ask yourself, if it was me and I'm taking this like super old design, because, we had the old, was it Mark I Terminator or whatever Saturnine was, you take that and you go, fundamentally kind of a goofy design. If you were to just reintroduce it into like just bigger and like a modern sculpt, it would probably look a lot of Saturnine that exists out there prior to the latest stuff has always been that kind of like comically large shoulder pads, basically take the original design and make it big. Yes. And I think for me, I've always enjoyed the sort of exploration of, okay, we'll try and take a silly idea really seriously. Okay, so, I'd have lots of conversations like, what is Saturnine? Is it like a proto Terminator armor? That's kind of, where I came at it from. Is like an original Terminator armor. Is it a really advanced set of Terminator armor? I've also done versions like that. And then you just kind of develop. I'm on record saying I'm not a huge fan of, the GW interpretation. And these guys, this guy here is like a development of an original kit that I made. So I made an original kit that looked a little bit like this, was much smaller, because for me, like, Saturnine was just going to be a suit of armor, and now they are fucking mini dreadnoughts as far as like scaling goes. But yeah, you start off with that simple question, and then you just start to develop. A fellow sculpting friend of mine always says that, I'm a huge fan of overlapping armor. I like very complicated overlapping armor forms. So that's part of the style. And then you just sort of, you build up and you build up and you build up. And then you sort of end up with this kind of design, really.
What I would say about, I think, your specific style when it comes to Heresy is that there's an elegance to it. I think there's almost like a sleekness. I don't want to say streamlined, because something like, a bulkingly huge Terminator is not streamlined, but I'm talking about more like the aesthetic composition of the sculpt. And I don't know if that comes down to maybe the slick sort of pleats that you do up the armor, just to add a few more curves and a few more angles. But on the stuff that you do, you can tell that your fingerprints have been on it, right? And if you were to maybe spread, a whole table out of the stuff that you've designed, there is sort of like that one design DNA. I think that runs through it all, no matter what you're sculpting, right? It's just kind of like become your style. Was that an organic sort of process that you just kind of stumbled across, or was it something that took a lot of experimentation and development?
Yeah,
And could you describe that style as well? Because I feel like you do, like Adam said, you do have a very distinctive style, and it's kind of it's visible across all the models that you sculpt. But I think perhaps for like the listeners and for me, Space Marines are the it's the kind of the design I'm most familiar with. So perhaps using like your kind of aesthetic in comparison to a Games Workshop kind of aesthetic, how would you kind of describe how you do things a bit differently? Because I think of smooth lines, I think of curves, and like fine detail when I think of your stuff.
I think it starts off with like, what do you think a Space Marine is? So I think for like, I'm not a fan of the Iron Warriors like at all. I mean, part of it comes down to like all the meaning around the fans and stuff like that. But a lot of it is just like that an Iron Warrior isn't what a Space Marine is for me. Like a Space Marine for me is a Dark Angel. A Space Marine for me is a Blood Angel. Space Marine for me is an Imperial Fist. A Space Marine for me is a sci-fi knight, in a kind of exaggerated world.
Yes.
And
I can see that just by looking at this example. Like,
yeah,
he's got a massive broadsword. He's got a knightly helmet. His leg sort of armor plating has something that is reminiscent of a medieval knight.
The robes as well.
It's a lot more gothic rather than an Iron Warrior, for example, who is maybe more utilitarian.
Yeah.
Or practical.
And I think and then it comes down to like what you think the wider world is really like, what part of it interests you, because like 40k or 30k is like such a broad thing. For me, like, I'm a huge fan of sci-fi fantasy. Like, I like my themes and my world to be fantasy, but like all the sort of tools and mechanics to be sci-fi. And so as part of that, I think there's a lot of people who like the grimdark aspect of 40k, 30k. They like the idea of, countless waves of human beings dying horrible deaths or whatever it is. And that just isn't for me. Like, and maybe the part of the Space Marines they like is that they're sort of horrible, amoral, brutalized biological weapons that are dispatched into the universe by an uncaring totalitarian regime. Like, that's a legitimate way to consider and approach Space Marines. But for me, they're Space Knights. So they go out there, and part of that, and they, I mean, maybe I wouldn't go as far as to claim that they sort of, Arthurian knights that save people, but like, if I was to sort of start trimming away parts of 40k that I wouldn't like, I would kind of end up at that. I've always disliked the part of 40k where they feel the need to undercut like Space Marines' heroic actions by being like, oh, but then they butchered like a planet because like arbitrary reasons, or like, oh, an Inquisitor turned up and made everything horrible because it's a horrible world. So that sort of like sci-fi fantasy element really, it's my jam, and it's why I like, it's a lot of why I like the weapons I choose and the armor designs that I choose. But I'm also a huge fan of, for me, like, a lot of Space Marine stuff sometimes ends up a little bit too clunky. Like, they're sort of 8 foot, 9 foot tall warriors, supplied by sort of a massive galaxy-wide supply network. They should have like an elegance to their designs, and their armors, should work. I mean, one of the criticisms I often get from the community is that everything I sculpt they think belongs to the Emperor's Children or like the Blood Angels, because I put trim and wings and stuff like that. But for me, that's just based.
There's a Renaissance aspect to it.
Yeah. That's just baseline. Like, I think, I mean, Ed ScoMo is like a huge inspiration of mine. And like you look at the original Praetors, and obviously they are the original Terminator and Power Armor Praetor that ScoMo did for Forge World. And you look at them, and I think there's, with modern production techniques, Space Marines and all models that GW makes invariably like suggest that there's like a uniformity to design in the Warhammer 40k universe. But I like the idea, I've always liked that those hand sculpted original ones, every power armor was different. You'd look at like an old 4th or 5th edition Space Marine, and all the armor plates are different. They'd have a different head, or they'd have a different, knee pad, and they weren't necessarily quantified or qualified. It was just like they were different. I mean, all of us old heads will remember the classic, was it 4th edition Ultramarines chaplain, like walking down the rows of Space Marines,
Yes.
all in the parade. And you look
Iconic.
and you look at the parade, and they're all technically in Mark 7, but there's just like little changes everywhere. And for me, like all of that sort of comes together into this big soup where, I like there to be this sort of like organic changing. It's a suit of plate armor. Like Joaz is another 3D artist who really inspires me. And you look at his stuff, and there's like so much thought that goes into like how would this Space Marine armor works. Like I remember he did like an Istvan themed render. Like he's more of like a render artist than like a 3D printing artist. And he did it where like the visor on the Mark II, I think it was, like hinged up. And I was like, wow, like that's just so cool. Like none of us think about that. We always just think like, oh, it's just a giant bucket they pop on their heads. Yeah. And I just love all of that stuff basically. And so, you sort of asked me at the beginning whether or not it's sort of like something I've chosen to do, and I would say probably not really. It's very organically generated by like just a series of questions. Of most of I think a lot of people want there to be like a sort of deep. I remember talking with Miles about this when I went and met him in Swansea. And he sort of wanted there to be this sort of like deep artistic reason for why I was doing what I was doing. And a lot of the time it's just, it's a combination of sort of petty, like I could think I can do it better than GW's done it or somebody else has done it. And also just like curiosity of asking yourself that question, like how would me do this thing that I haven't seen done before? It's why I wouldn't, people have asked me in the past, like, how would I do Mark 6? Like I wouldn't do Mark 6, partially because I don't like the armor, but also I just kind of think, well, GW have done it as good as I can think of doing it, kind of thing, really, if that makes sense. So I think that's probably how the style is really developed. I
think what I will say about this common theme that runs through your models is that they've got a very cinematic quality to them as well. The composition of the model as a whole, he's either doing something, or he's got like he's part of a scene that you've sort of created into like this broader sort of diorama, or he's just got a presence about him that looks like a shot from a film.
Yeah.
It's not just the guy standing on a tactical rock. It goes that one step further. I mean, all the models that we've shown up to this point have that sort of cinematic quality. And if I was to bring up like this piece here, like that's cinema on a biblical sort of proportion. Do you want to speak to this model specifically, or would you rather sort of talk about it in a more general sense?
Yeah, I mean, I can do a little bit of both. But I mean, I think for me, like Lord of the Rings, for a lot of us, sort of zillennials, or younger millennials. Like Lord of the Rings was like incredibly impactful. And I think what's wonderful about Lord of the Rings is there's like a realism to it on one side, but there's like a sense that everything is part of like some grander tale. Like the world is big and it's mythical, and it's not, there's majesty hidden everywhere, and it's sort of this wonderful blend where everything that exists has both like a quotidian, like a fantastical mythical side. It's sort of like everything is self-mythologizing in a way that I think is quite wonderful, really. And so for me, whenever I think about like sculpting something, it's picturing the scene rather than like the individual like model. Really, it's not just picturing the scene, it's picturing like the emotion and the vibe and the feeling of the scene, and then trying to sort of direct everything towards that. What am I trying to capture? What's like the feeling? And then the design of like the individual thing comes after, because once you've sculpted one Marine, you've sculpted 10 Marines, and you've sculpted 100 Marines. And one of the wonderful things about Marines is that if you sculpted one armor mark, you just copy paste it over. And if you work non-destructively, which is modeling lingo for basically everything is reversible. Modeling non-destructively means you can just kind of copy paste your original armor mark and then just modify it, and it just makes it it's super easy to kind of like rapidly develop Space Marine. So like the actual armor design itself, like very unimportant. So then it becomes about like, what am I trying to capture here? So for example, in this case, I'm a huge Blood Angels fan. Like I've been sculpting Ultramarines for my personal army for like 4 years now, or even longer. But my original love was Blood Angels, and probably still is to a certain extent. And I just really wanted to. I did my first MPO online, which was my first competition, and I entered the Guilliman that popped up earlier. And it kind of got me the itch, really. And a lot of people sort of poo-poo online events, but I think just doing your best. When Patreon is a very rapid fire, you have to make 3 or 4 kits a month, so you're like working like incredible pace. And so for me, being able to like slow down and spend, Cornell challenging me to do this Guilliman for MPO, or to finish him off, because I was working on him anyway for like personal army reasons. And that kind of gave me the bug. And next year I was like, I'm going to go even bigger. I'm going to go even more dramatic. And so I was working on this guy. And I think for me, it starts with, I don't know, maybe it's the architect in me. But I like compositions that feel sort of fun, and going back to Lord of the Rings, I obviously love the Gandalf. It's like falling into the chasm with the Balrog, and so I just sort of started working. I'd already started on a Sanguinius. I'm a terrible starter of projects. I sort of you sort of throw a bunch of stuff on a page and then you can like leave it. It's not like with models where you sort of end up with like a studio that's sort of filling up. You've just got a hard drive. And so, you don't ever have a pile of shame that is looking at you from a corner. You just sort of have a folder of shame, and you just don't have to open it. And then you just sort of start developing. And Andy Wardle was telling me how wonderful a competition in Italy called Monte Sansevino was. And so I decided to go to that, and I got this guy finished for there. And it's probably like the most time I've spent on the project, just because it's, it's just so much to sculpt, really. But it was sort of everything that I pictured Sanguinius on Cygnus as, really, and there's a sort of confluence of inspiration. You want like really strong like standing, and like the angel wings going like sideways, and then the demon wings going up. I played around with a bunch of different compositions, chatting with Jose, and then, I mean, sadly, I imagine it's probably similar to you guys with painting. You sort of have like this sort of fun, like explosion of activity and creativity to start, and then you've got to like detail 15 million feathers, and then you just got to sit down and do that, and then the sort of fun and the creativity like rapidly drains through your feet. But yeah, no, it was tremendously fun. I will say, I probably wouldn't want to do something. I mean, I say I wouldn't want to do something on that scale again, but I kind of do. But yeah, I mean, with Primarchs, I think you can try and contain yourself with Marines, because at the end of the day, a Marine is a Marine is a Marine. But I think with Primarchs, they're individuals, and some of them have been clearly defined by GW. Like, I think it'd be very hard to redefine Horus, for example. Like, Horus's design has kind of been set in stone for a long time. But there's other Primarchs out there like Guilliman or Sanguinius or like Vulcan or, I don't know, Mortarion, where I think there's a whole space for you to kind of go like, okay, well, it's not that I dislike GW's interpretation, but like, what's mine? Like, and so yeah, sort of all those things came together with this piece.
There's areas to explore, I guess. So when you're conceptualizing, is this something that always starts in your head? You mentioned sketching before. Do you get ideas down or designs down on paper? Is there a degree of concept art that precedes something like this?
So it really depends. Like, some stuff, I mean, for me, sketching is like a really good way of like figuring things out. So some like this piece, for example, it was all like, take this. So this was pre knowing that we were going to get a Saturnine Dreadnought. This was me, this is another one of those like what if questions. This is me going, if Saturnine exists, could Saturnine Dreadnought exist? ? And if Saturnine, I designed the Saturnine Terminator armor before this, which was also a sketch that I then turned into that model. And so I'd kind of taken this model and been like, taken that sketch and been like, okay, well, let's develop this into like an actual design. And often with the sketching, I'm doing it when I'm not near my computer, so I can't, I've got the itch. I can't scratch it by like modeling, so I'm just going to go scratch it by sketching. With composition stuff, there is a lot of like very, very rough, just sort of like doodling and thinking. There's a lot of walking, to be honest. I think, to get on my soapbox very, very briefly, I think this is what people miss with the AI discussions around 3D modeling, is so much of designing is just like the process you're going through. Like, the end result, it is what it is. It's what people print. It's what people pay for. So, I mean, there is a value to it. But so much of the design process is like going on a long walk, reading, remembering that manga you read from 15 years ago, listening to some epic music whilst at the gym, and then like picturing some Space Marines fighting, all those kind of like slightly cringy, slightly nerdy,
imaginative excursions.
Yeah, exactly. And then sort of, I talked about my folder of shame, and a lot of those sort of eventually become my best designs, like the Sanguinius, for example. You start him, and then you have like a 4-month hiatus because the modeling isn't flowing. You've got other things to do. And then you're out on a walk one day and you just kind of think, oh yeah, that's sanguineous. I could do it like that. And then you go, oh, fuck me. And then you go back to it and then you spend like 2 days of like feverish, I'm working on a massive, I guess like Titan-esque model at the moment, which would be my interpretation of the Imperator. And that's been ongoing for like 4 or 5 years, in various iterations and stages and stuff like that. Because it's just such a monstrous project. And it's, it's going to consume a huge amount of time. And actually, who the fuck really wants to print like a 1200mm tool Titan?
There'll be people out there.
Well, probably. But every so often, you just kind of get like a burst of inspiration. You work on it, and then it goes back in the folder, and then you'll re-emerge in 6 months or a year, or when you get some spare time.
I think that's a really organic process, though. I mean, all artists work differently, of course. Some could come in one afternoon when inspiration strikes and finish their canvas, right? Yeah. Others will labor on it back and forth for years and years and years before they call it done. So, it seems incredibly organic in that regard. Yeah, and I mean, I think that's. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, with that organic kind of flow and being able to move between projects and stuff, do you have much time to do your own projects, or are you typically kind of producing with other people in mind, even if it's not necessarily a commission per se?
I think that's kind of like the double-edged sword of the way I work and also the job that I do, is that it doesn't allow for much separation between sort of time off and time on, really. When you are working, you're working on something you really want to work on. And, I always feel vaguely sorry for my long-suffering patrons, because I'm sure people join and they're just like, I joined for this model, and then like next month is a different model, and then you're back again, and I don't understand what the fuck is going on. But because I just give them what I want to give them, really. That's partially because I just have, I have so many ideas that I can't get them all out, and I want to get them all out, and in the end it all sort of like emerges in this sort of like unkempt tide of sort of ideas. But no, it is, last year when I was kind of I did get quite burnt out, because you work on work stuff, and that's work stuff. But then if you want to have a bit of fun, you work on something, and then you go, oh, it's okay, I'll sell it. So it justifies you working on non-work stuff. And then you got some commission. And commission is fun because, with Patreon, you are the concept artist, you are the art director, you are the designer, you are the engineer, you're kind of doing all these things. And I mean, we'll talk about Trenchcade later, I'm sure. But like, there's something wonderful about working with like such skilled artists like Mike, where some guys go like, you, modeling monkey, like, here's a design, here's the poses, here's the weapon, make it for me and I'll pay you. And you're going to go, yes, sir. You whack on some Netflix and you work very, very quickly. And I mean, there is, and I've tried to be better with that myself, where I kind of, started carving myself into like various identities at work, where I kind of go, for example, this year I've mapped out my entire year in model releases, because there's a model that I sent you where I designed it. I've been thinking about it. It was on my like slate of things to do for work, and then I'm thinking about, I'm like, what should I do? So I get out my iPad and get out Procreate, and I do some sketching, and I've got a sketch, and then I take that sketch and I put it in Blender, and then 3 days later I've done a model. So it's, that's probably how I should work. But there is like a magic to, like you say, the organic process, where you kind of pick something up, put something down, let it kind of take you where it wants to take you. It's not flowing, so you're not going to rush it. You're gonna take a step back, go work on something else, re-emerge when you've got some fresh ideas for it. But no, it is, I've been very lucky, I think, that whatever I'm putting down, people are picking up, because, we have various groups with Patreon creators in there, and there's nothing that breaks my heart more than when you see a creator who's got a clear idea of what they want to do, but like people just aren't interested, and you're like, that's kind of sad, because in some ways you're putting yourself out there and saying, hey guys, this is my vision of whatever it is, and in some ways it's what I would say we want more of in the space, which is kind of like fresh ideas, unique ideas, not just like obvious like proxies or whatever you want to call it. But people just aren't biting, and it's really sad, because then they sort of start turning around, and there is, like I said before, there's this gamut, are you a modeler, are you an artist? And there are definitely modelers out there who are very procedural in their, you get a concept artist, they go like, let's go and get the Sisters of Battle Codex, and like, okay, well, this unit will do it like this, and we're going to do Sisters of Battle, but like, themed around Japan. Okay, well, Bish, Sisters unit, this, that, and you kind of you make a very systematized variant of it. But I don't know, that isn't for me, and I also just kind of think, I guess there's a place for it, and these people make a lot more money than me, so maybe they're the real winners in the end. But I don't know, it's a bit sad, really. I just kind of think, come on, like, where's your sort of artistic spark, I suppose.
Yeah. So you did mention Trench Crusade. Now you are working on branching out into different IPs. Do you want to speak to your Trench Crusade stuff for a little bit while I get some photos up here?
Yeah. So, I mean, I was like super lucky that basically Mike messaged me, DM'd me on Twitter, and said, would you like to come and work for TC for their Kickstarter? And of course I said yeah, because all of us kind of has known Mike's work for forever and forever, really. And I was fortunate enough to work on 4 different things for them. For at least the initial Kickstarter, so I worked on the HMI, which is the New Antioch like heavy like power armor dudes. I worked on the Shock Troopers for New Antioch. I worked on the what is it? The Shrine Anchorite, which is like their dreadnought type thing with the church head. And then I also worked on the Castigator, which is sort of like a one-off character. And it was just really fun, because I've touched on a few times, like the sort of low bar for entry into what we do. Sometimes, there's nothing like forces you to be professional in a lot of ways. You can be sat in your pajamas with 10 patrons. You can be sat in your pajamas with 1,500 patrons. Like, you're earning infinitely more money, but there's like nothing that sort of incentivizes you to consider it a real job, or like to invoice properly, or to market yourself properly. It's just kind of, you're still the same dude, you're just earning a lot more money. So for me, getting somebody like Mike to come along and say like, hey, I really like your stuff, can you make stuff for like an actual IP, an actual project, was like really special. And it was just good fun, because you, like I say, you get to see a different side of it. Where you are, that's the Castigator, and it's a limited scope. So when I started working on Trench Crusade in 2024, I was sort of so caught up in this idea that everything I needed to make needed to be unique or put a fresh spin on everything. I've espoused my love for Ed Scomo before, but I look at his Velataris, for example, and it's just, he has rethought every inch of that model. you know, it could have been so much simpler, you know, so much more phoned in, but he's kind of, there's a thought process that's gone into every part. And I was like locked into like, I need to do that, which meant I was generating these incredibly complex sculpts that I think people just weren't, people were struggling to connect with. I was struggling to connect with, because the more complex you make a design, the more pieces you put into it, the more refining it has to do, and you're working very fast. So Trench Crusade was really good for me because it made me like step all the way back and go, actually, you know what? If an idea is good, even if it's been done before, even if it's simple, you know, World War One plus church, not the most original like idea on the planet, but it's executed well. You know, it can be very powerful, and that really impacted me. And then I've done a little bit more work for them since. Sadly, it's the Shrine Anchorite. Sadly, like they're obviously, I mean, not sad to them, but they've had rip-roaring success, which is amazing. But it means they've transitioned into plastic production now, and I'm not. I mean, I tried doing plastic. And I'm just not very good at it, really. Like, it's a whole different workflow, and you know, I think what a lot of
almost like a different medium entirely, right?
Yeah, I think what a lot of creators for 3D prints don't realize is that we have one of the most flexible mediums out there. You know, you could throw some real bullshit at a 3D printer, and 3D printer will chug away, and you know, it'll probably, maybe you'll ruin effect, but you'll get something out of there at the end. Whereas like plastic, you cannot fuck around. So I hopefully they'll have a little bit of work for me here and there. And previously you showed off, this chap here, which is the Maximilian armor. So this is
I love this. Like I mentioned, the cinematic quality to things before, like this has everything. There's little stories everywhere in this diorama. It's amazing. And look, I wasn't super into Trench Crusades in the beginning, but after you made this, I was like, I get it now. I get it.
Well, I think again it comes down to, I mean, this was based on a piece by a really amazing artist called German artist Inkase, I think is her Instagram handle. But she did this on like an official commission for TC, which is why I can't sell this, sadly. But it was just an amazing piece. Not in this pose, it was sort of a completely different pose, but it just completely took me. And sometimes you just gotta, that's one of the benefits of working yourself, is I was just like, I've got to sculpt this. So I just took 2 or 3 days, did the base mesh, and then I was like, oh yeah, MPO's coming up in 6 weeks or something like that. I'll do this for MPO. And there's a XGW artist called Thomas. He's doing a really cool project called Eschaton.
Pyrenan, is it? Thomas?
No, that's TC guy. No, this is an artist who's only just left, but he's doing this really cool project called Eschaton. And part of that, he's a sort of traditional artist. As part of that, he did this scene of like a giant armored figure being overwhelmed by like mutant hordes. And I'd started sculpting one, and I thought, actually, this is, all these vibes are coming together. And I was like, I'm going to do this Maximilian armor being overwhelmed by, by heretics, basically. Changed it around because the Maximilian came with little dudes, like little accompanying like squires or whatever they're called. Then just took it from there. And obviously, because this was for myself, I was able to kind of like push it to a level that probably if I was like working for TC, it wouldn't get pushed to. Not because I'd be like lazy or anything like that, but just like this would be less fun to paint. than probably what I would do for TC, because they would probably tell me to like dial it back slightly on like the amount of detail I was like chucking at the model. But because this was just going to be a, you know, just a personal sort of how far can you go kind of project, I could kind of do that. And I've become really addicted to doing dioramas. I mean, lately, I think there's like a, you know, there's a, with 3D models, they just kind of go out into the ether, and your voice as an artist is lost very quickly, because they go up for $10, people buy them, people chop them up, people pirate them. Like, you know, people have got, you know, 15 million copies of roughly the same thing, because people have got to collect all the files. And so for me, I've become quite obsessed over the last few years on the ideas of things that are sort of self-contained, really. And for me, like a diorama is the ultimate version of that. I mean, I'd like to think we speak for all of us when we say, you know, we love the character series from GW, you know, with the little removable bases and all that kind of jazz. Yeah, so things like this where you just, you know, you're just trying to tell a story, and it gives like a reason for why the models exist. And then there's like a fun engineering problem to it as well, when you try and make all like the bases removable and stuff like that. And yeah, it's just, yeah, for me, it's just very, very fun. I think there are some sculptors out there who, you know, love doing the sort of amazing, like single, like large scale figure or whatever. And just for me, it just, at the moment, at least, it happens to be that I'd like doing incredibly complicated dioramas.
Amazing. So what's next for your sort of sculpting journey, do you think? Are you prepared to venture into new things? Do you want to stick to maybe the similar sort of trends or IP, or are you developing your own range of things? Like, what's to come?
So I've always, you know, with Patreon, it's always kind of been my own world, I guess. It's not a world that I've ever kind of, it's always just been a framework for me to build my ideas on, rather than necessarily like share with people. But I think I've got lots of sculptor friends who have kind of done the very brave thing of kind of starting their own IP. And I find myself now, after 4 or 5 years, you know, and even if I still think of myself as like a better sculptor, like in kind of like raw ability terms than them, there's something to be said for having like a body of work that like amounts to something. Like my body of work sort of amounts to like a collection of random like Wilph ideas or challenges or commissions, and it's like fun, but you can't sort of put it all together and be like, this is sort of amounted to something. So I'd like to do a bit more of that this year. I really want to do a resin cast army, because an analogy I often use is that 3D files are like listening to Spotify or Apple Music. You know, they're cheap, they're not necessarily bad, but because they're so available, they lose a lot of their inherent value. You know, like I put on Apple Music, I wander out of the room, I wander back into the room, I go upstairs and do some work, and Apple Music is playing all the time. There might be songs down there I really like, but because they're free and I've got unlimited access to all the songs in the world through Apple Music, it just chugs away in the background. Whereas like vinyl, which is how I would describe like a resin cast sort of classical, you know, Tortuga or old Forge World, that's like vinyl, because it's very expensive. It's a pain in the ass to use. Like getting hold of it is tricky. But because there's this whole sort of ritual in sociological sense that goes into like resin, it makes it special and it makes it valuable. You know, you sit down with that character series model you paid, probably in Australia, I don't even want to think how much money you'd have to pay for a legit character series model. But you sit there and you're like, this is my one character series model, and it took 3 months to get here, and it cost me, you know, 3 months' wages, and it's special because of that. And if somebody just sent you like a box of 6 of them and it cost you $10, you'd be like, fuck it. Like, if I mess one up, who cares? If I break one, who cares? Like, if I don't print it very well, who cares? Like, so I really want to try and, do like a sort of classic, like looking at the Krieg range, looking at the original Solar Auxilia range, like Imperial Guard style resin cast. Whether there's a market out there for it, I don't really know, because I think people like the idea of the old days until you go to them and you say, actually, this army has 200 models, and it's because I'm having to pay somebody to do all the casting for me, it's going to be £60 a squad. So please, if you want to buy like a full army, you owe me £1,000. Suddenly people turn around and go, actually, you know what? Printed resin is, it's good enough. So I'd love to do that. I've got some TCE warbands planned with some friends because they're good fun. Yeah, like just a whole range of stuff. I mean, obviously, we talked before we went live. Trying to get this Heresy army finished, and I've sculpted all of that myself. So hopefully there'll be pictures of that up soon, and that will sort of spur a further launching into more Heresy stuff. And at that point, it's all going to be just for me. Like, there's no sort of for anybody else. So there's a joy. There's a joy in that, really. And then I don't know whether I'll be in the right part of the world at the time, but I'd quite like to go back to Monte San Savino this year. And when I went with like one piece I worked really, really hard on. And I did get a medal, but there was sort of something quite. I think when you take one piece to an event, you put a lot of hope. You don't even know what you're hoping for. You're just kind of, you sort of put all yourself into this model, and if it doesn't do as well as you think it might or should, even if you don't have any expectations at all, there's sort of dissatisfaction with it. So this year, I'd quite like to just turn up with like a whole bevy of things. Stuff I sculpted for work, stuff I sculpted for myself. Just a portfolio of work, I suppose. And just hope that means there's just like a whole load less pressure, because you're just like, yeah, this is just what I've done. And if you like it, then that's cool. And if you don't like it, then who cares? But yeah.
I've got one last question. Go ahead, Kieran. I've got one more question
I was just going to say, I was pretty excited by the mention of the Imperator earlier. Do you have any other kind of large projects that are kind of on the back burner now that you'd like to get back to, apart from the Imperator?
So I'm outspoken on a lot of things, but I've got a massive terrain Kickstarter project, because I love the idea of ZM. I mean, I don't know how it works in 3.0, but back in 1.0, you used to be able to have like zones of ZM on like a frontline table, right? You'd sort of be able to play. You'd be like, oh, this little area is enclosed enough that we're going to play with ZM rules in there. And for me, like terrain, I can understand why, because it makes it more fun to play with. But for me, terrain has always been too small. I love the idea of like a Vienna style apartment building with 5 floors, and there's a Solar Auxilia gun team on like the 3rd floor, and it's thick and it's dense, and you have to send in like some breachers to try and dig them out, because it's it's narrow hallways, and we count it as ZM, and the buildings are massive, and you've got a concert hall where the atrium is so big that there's like a Saturnine dreadnought or a knight. It's big enough for a knight to fit inside it, and you've got a victory arch so massive that a Baneblade can pass underneath it. Sort of big terrain that like might be a pain to play with, but like really, really emphasizes that like incredible cinematic quality. I love the idea of like Marines fighting down a hallway in the shadow of statues, large enough to dwarf a Warhound Titan. I want big cinematic scale. So I've got that terrain project that maybe will come out this year, maybe that'll come out next year, but that's been a long brewing thing.
Sounds amazing.
I really want to do I did some test models for, you know, like in the stories you hear stuff about like Leviathan land crawlers, you know, sort of the big capital imperialist, you know, style things. I love the idea of, this goes back to the same ZM concept. I love the idea of doing like the shell of, you know, like the front end of a crawler that you can, somebody could place on a board and then has little modular ZM interiors. So you could be like, oh, we have the land crawler and we're going to, you know, one of the objectives is you have to break into it and rescue prisoners from the prison cell. So you organize the interior to be like a prison cell or whatever it is, and have like this big sort of interactive terrain piece, you know, that wouldn't necessarily move, but maybe has guns on it that could fire back, and would occupy sort of maybe like, you know, 2 foot by 1 foot. And be this whole thing, and maybe there's you know, the land crawler version and there's like a landed ship version. Quite like to do that. You know, got a few more Titan projects to do. Yeah, like, I mean, me and some friends are working on a skirmish game, but that's going to be sort of 18 months, 2 years out probably. So nothing to show on that yet. But yeah, sort of, you know, I've always got like a million Kickstarter ideas, a million sort of army ideas and projects and all those kinds of things. And it's just about like controlling myself long enough to see one of them pop out.
Now, I've got a question that I probably should have asked earlier. It's just come to me now. And it's about where you see the 3D sculpting landscape heading. Now, I don't want to trigger your outspokenness, but how do you think technologies like AI are really going to influence how we're going to start doing these things? How are they going to influence artists moving forward? Are they going to maybe undermine them to a certain point and maybe take away some of what they do? Or do you see them more as maybe like a tool that can be used and utilized?
I mean, I don't see the point in them, personally speaking. Like, I mean, you talked about like the journey being this whole thing, and I just think like the AI is doing the journey for you, and like, but I want to go on the journey. Like,
it's Lord of the Rings. You want to go on the journey.
Yeah, exactly. Like, you know, I mean, obviously in Lord of the Rings, they know the end point. Like, I don't know what my Mount Doom is, but like, I'm going to know once I've gone on that journey. Like, once I've walked out, you know, take, you know, left the Shire behind. And so for me, like, AI just doesn't serve a use in that sense. Like, it's not about like, is it good, is it bad, or like, does the quality of the stuff it makes good or bad or whatever. Like, I just don't get it. Like, I've known 3D modelers who use it to like paint their models for better display. Like, but don't you want to paint it yourself so you know if it's fun to paint? Like, what's the point of getting an AI to do it? Like, it's, you know, I obviously can get annoyed by people who like, you know, poke me with it and go like, like, you're going to be replaced. But I just don't get the point of it, I suppose, is for me. I just don't understand, like, and, you know, will it replace us? I think, so the way I always talk about it with my friends, because, you know, some of my fellow colleagues get very, very down and depressed about the whole thing. For me, what we do is like a boutique job, fundamentally. You know, at the moment I have, I don't know, maybe 350, 400 patrons. And that's out of like a nerd community. Even if we just take like North America, Europe, that's all like 1 billion people all told. And, you know, so let's say 1% of them do the hobby, and then 1% of that 1% own a 3D printer, and then like 1% of that 1% like buys my models. I think that's like 10,000 patrons a month, which is so much money that I wouldn't know what to do with it. So like the amount of people that you need to like believe in you as like an individual for you to like live a relatively good life is very, very small. I think as well, you know, we are already seen as like a cost saving measure. You know, like 3D printing your files is already seen as a cheaper way of doing things than buying quality, like buying plastics or whatever. So I think in that sense, a lot of people will be quite happy to pay. And maybe I'm doing like, you know, the how much can a banana possibly cost meme, but like we cost £10 a month. Like that's the average, you know, $10, €10, £10. That's like the average Patreon price. And for that, people get a lot of stuff. And, you know, part of the deal is a lot of people get stuff they don't want, you know, so maybe they subscribe and they get one thing they want, or maybe they subscribe and only every other month or every 3 months they get something they want. But, you know, people get a lot of stuff. And we talked earlier about the quality of the models. A lot of like the expectations for Patreons were set back when people were making not very good stuff. And sadly, making good stuff takes a lot more time. And I'm not just talking about like terms of design. I'm talking about like printability, buildability, like, you know, this all takes more time. So all of that sort of comes together for me to just assume that like people can like AI generate a space marine. I mean, God bless and God help the people who are like generating those AIs, because GW Legal is going to come and hang you by your ankles from like the nearby bridge as like a warning to the world. But, you know, people can do that.
Well, yeah, you're starting to see that with class action lawsuits with things like Disney and Marvel trying to protect their IPs, right? And taking companies like OpenAI to court.
Yeah. And so I just think a combination of like that plus, you know, maybe a naive belief that what we make does have like an artistic vision and people are willing to support an artistic vision. I think one of the good things that's come out in the last few years in the 3D printing space is there's a lot more people who are just like, hey dude, like I'm supporting you because I think what you make is cool. Like, and you know, I'm quite happy to give you $10 a month because I think what you make is cool. And like every so often I print something, but you know, most of the time I just think your stuff is cool. And then probably like if AI becomes so good that all of those things are no longer true, you know, somebody can generate an amazing model that is cut up great, that is pre-supported great, that has like great creative vision. If all those things come true, I just think we have bigger problems. You know, in the UK,
I was about to say the exact same thing. Yeah.
You know,
yeah. If sculpting's an issue, I think the rest of us are fucked anyway.
Yeah, exactly. You know, like, I could try and escape and try and find another job, but in the UK, 6 million jobs, I think, one sort of inquest found were at risk from AI. If 6 million people are made redundant in the UK, then it doesn't matter like what I choose to do. Like the country's fucked. Like, you know, so I just try not to think about it really, I suppose, at the end of the day. And maybe that's stupid, but I just think we're out here, we're making stuff, we make stuff with love, we make stuff with creativity. You know, we don't need that many people to say, you know what, I'm buying what that guy's selling, and you know, you can live a comfortable life, as I very fortunately have.
Amazing. All right, well, plug your stuff. Where can people find you? Where can they explore the world of Diverging Realm?
So my Instagram handle is Wilph, Diverging Realm. My Patreon and my tribes are both Diverging Realm. I have a hobby, I guess. I've tried to be a bit better now at separating like my work stuff from my like hobby stuff. So I have a hobby account called Wilph Hammer. So that's where you can find all my 30K stuff. But yeah, apart from that, I'm sort of, you know, I pop up now and again in various Discords or whatever. You know, if you want, you know, any advice or anything like that, feel free to message me. I'm terrible at messaging back, so don't be disheartened if you sent me like a message request 6 months ago and I never spotted it. Like it's just because like I I'm useless. So feel free to send one again. But yeah.
Amazing. Well, Kieran, if you've got nothing more to ask Wilph, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on today.
Thank you for having me.
My whole perspective on sculpting has changed. It's been incredible to hear about your sort of sculpting journey as well.
Mm-hmm.
I'm certainly feeling inspired, not only for Heresy, but to maybe explore the sculpting world a little bit further.
Yeah. I mean, if you
because
ever
it is kind of just nipping at my heels,
Mm.
and it has been for the last 6 months. I just don't know if I want to take the plunge into that sort of experimental phase just yet. But who knows? Who knows?
I mean, if you think it takes you a long time to paint an army to a perfect standard, then sculpting an army to a perfect standard and then painting it to a perfect standard takes 4 or 5 times longer, or never, in my case.
I could be working on Ultramarines for 5 years.
Yeah.
Wilph, thanks again for coming on. Would love to have you back.
Yeah.
Maybe discussing something entirely different, maybe like creating dioramas. That'd be amazing.
Cool.
Whatever the topic is, it'd be awesome to have you back. So thanks very much.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Wilph.
Anything else to add, Kieran?
No, just thanks to Wilph for being so generous with his time. It's been eye-opening. You tell a really good story, and it's really engaging to listen to. So I thoroughly enjoyed that.
Thank you.
Amazing. All right. If you want to find out all of Wilph's stuff, we'll put it in the show notes. Make sure you check out his Instagram, his personal Instagram as well, with all his hobby updates, and more importantly, his Patreon. Support artists.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, and stay hard for heresy, everybody.
Good night.
Hard for heresy.